It was November 16th in the year 1532 that Francisco Pizarro, the Spanish explorer and conquistador, springs a trap on the Incan emperor Atahualpa. With fewer than 200 men against several thousand, Pizarro lures Atahualpa to a feast in the emperor's honor and then opens fire on the unarmed Incans. Pizarro's men eventually win this battle and capture Atahualpa, forcing him to convert to Christianity. On this day, he also continued his eternity. By 1532, the Inca Empire was embroiled in a civil war that had decimated the population and divided the people's loyalties. Atahualpa, the younger son of former Incan ruler Huayna Capac, had just deposed his half-brother Huascar and was in the midst of reuniting his kingdom when Pizarro arrived in 1531 with the endorsement of Spain's King Charles V. On his way to the Incan capital, Pizarro learned of the war and began recruiting soldiers still loyal to Huascar. Pizarro met Atahualpa just outside Cajamarca, a small Incan town tucked into a valley of the Andes. Sending his brother Hernan as an envoy, Pizarro invited Atahualpa back to Cajamarca for a feast in honor of Atahualpa's ascendance to the throne. Though he had nearly 80,000 soldiers with him in the mountains, Atahualpa consented to attend the feast with only 5,000 unarmed men. He was met by Vicente de Valverde, a friar traveling with Pizarro. While Pizarro's men lay in wait, Valverde urged Atahualpa to convert and accept Charles V as sovereign. Atahualpa angrily refused, prompting Valverde to give the signal for Pizarro to open fire. Trapped in tight quarters, the panicking Incan soldiers made easy prey for the Spanish. In just an hour, 5,000 Incans continued their eternity as a result. Pizarro himself suffered the only Spanish injury, a cut on his hand sustained as he saved Atahualpa from death. Realizing Atahualpa was initially more valuable alive than dead, Pizarro kept the emperor in captivity while he made plans to take over his empire. In response, Atahualpa appealed to his captors' greed, offering them a room full of gold and silver in exchange for his liberation. Pizarro consented, but after receiving the ransom, Pizarro brought Atahualpa upon charges of stirring up rebellion. By that time, Atahualpa had played his part in pacifying the Incans while Pizarro secured his power, and Pizarro considered him disposable. Atahualpa was to be burned at the stake. The Spanish believed this to be a fitting death for a heathen, but at the last moment, Valverde offered the emperor clemency if he would convert. They fooled him. Atahualpa submitted but was strangled. He continued his eternity on August 29th in 1533. Fighting between the Spanish and the Incas would continue well after Atahualpa's death as Spain consolidated its conquest. Pizarro's bold victory at Cajamarca, however, effectively marked the end of the Inca Empire and the beginning of the European colonization of South America. It was November 16th in the year 1849 that a Russian court sentences Fyodor Dostoevsky to death for his allegedly anti-government activities linked to a radical intellectual group. His execution is stayed at the last minute. Dostoevsky's father was a doctor at Moscow's Hospital for the Poor, where he grew rich enough to buy lands and serfs. After his father's continuance of paternity, Dostoevsky, who suffered from epilepsy, studied military engineering and became a civil servant while secretly writing novels. His first, Poor People, and his second, The Double, were both published in 1846. The first was a hit, the second, a failure. Dostoevsky began participating in a radical intellectual discussion group called the Petrashevsky Circle. The group was suspected of subversive activities, which led to Dostoevsky's arrest in 1849 and his sentencing to death. On December 22nd, 1849, Dostoevsky was led before the firing squad but received a last-minute reprieve and was sent to a Siberian labor camp where he worked for 4 years. He was released in 1854 and worked as a soldier on the Mongolian frontier. He married a widow and finally returned to Russia in 1859. The following year, he founded a magazine, and 2 years after that, journeyed to Europe for the first time. 1864 and 1865, his wife and his brother continued their fraternities. The magazine folded and Dostoevsky found himself deeply in debt, which he exacerbated by gambling. In 1866, he published Crime and Punishment, one of his most popular works. That's the one I read. In 1867, he married a stenographer, and the couple fled to Europe to escape his creditors. His novel, The Possessed, never read that one, in 1872 was successful, and the couple returned to St. Petersburg. He published The Brothers Karamazov in 1880 to immediate success, but he continued his eternity a year later. I've never read The Brothers Karamazov, but I've seen The Brothers Bloom. On November 16th in 1945, German scientists were brought to our beautiful United States to work on rocket technology. Smart move. And a move that stirs up some controversy as part of Operation Paperclip. The United States ships 88 German scientists to America to assist the nation in its production of rocket technology. Most of these men had served under the Nazi regime, and critics in the United States questioned the morality of placing them in the service of our nation. Nevertheless, the U.S. government, desperate to acquire the scientific know-how that had produced the terrifying and destructive V-1 and V-2 rockets for Germany during World War II, and fearful that the Russians were also utilizing captured German scientists for the same end, welcomed the men with open arms. Realizing that the importation of scientists who had so recently worked for the Nazi regime, so hated by Americans, was a delicate public relations situation, the U.S. military cloaked the operation in secrecy. In announcing the plan, a military spokesman merely indicated that some German scientists who had worked on the rocket development had volunteered to come to the United States and work for a, quote, very moderate salary, unquote. Sorry about that. The voluntary nature of the scheme was somewhat undercut by the admission that the scientists were in, quote, protective custody. Upon their arrival in the U.S. on November 16th, newsmen and photographers were not allowed to interview or photograph the newcomers. A few days later, a source in Sweden claimed that the scientists were members of the Nazi team at Peenemünde. Oh, I'm about to look that up. Peenemünde, where the V weapons had been produced. The U.S. government continued to remain somewhat vague about the situation, stating only that, quote, certain outstanding German scientists and technicians, unquote, were being imported in order to, quote, take full advantage of these significant developments which are deemed vital to our national security, unquote, which was true. The situation pointed out one of the many ironies connected with the Cold War. That irony was the United States and the Soviet Union, once allies against Germany and the Nazi regime during World War II, were now in a fierce contest to acquire the best and brightest scientists who had helped arm the German forces in order to construct weapon systems to threaten each other. The information documented and divulged on this audio file can be verified on history.com.